My ex-husband froze the moment he realized the billionaire standing beside me was introducing me as his wife. 2 years earlier, he had laughed in front of a room full of people and told everyone I would never be enough. Funny how life has a way of finishing conversations that pride starts. My name is Maya Bennett, and if you had met me back then, you probably wouldn't have remembered me. I was the woman who quietly made everyone else's life easier. I remembered birthdays without needing reminders. I stayed late to help coworkers finish impossible projects. I always carried an extra umbrella because someone usually forgot theirs. I believed kindness always found its way back. What I didn't understand was that some people become so accustomed to your kindness that they stop noticing it altogether. The Whitmore Foundation Gala was already in full swing when Ethan and I stepped into the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors, while a string quartet played softly beneath hundreds of quiet conversations. Waiters moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and champagne. Camera flashes lit up the room every few seconds as donors, executives, and community leaders greeted one another. Ethan glanced toward me and smiled. "Ready?" he asked. "Always," I answered. He gently squeezed my hand before we walked toward the center of the ballroom together. That was when I saw Caleb. He stood only a few yards away, holding a champagne glass that never reached his lips. His eyes met mine for barely a second before dropping to the wedding band on my hand. Then they moved toward the foundation display beside the stage where our names appeared beneath the logo. Ethan and Maya Whitmore. The color slowly disappeared from his face. He looked exactly the way I had looked 2 years earlier when someone I trusted shattered my confidence with a single sentence. Everything around him seemed to fade into the background. The music, the conversations, the applause beginning near the stage. None of it mattered anymore. He kept staring as though he could somehow convince himself he was looking at the wrong woman. He had expected me to disappear after our divorce. Instead, I had built a life so different from the one he imagined that he couldn't even understand how I had reached it. Ethan leaned toward me and quietly asked whether I wanted another glass of sparkling water before the opening ceremony. I smiled and nodded. As he walked away, I caught Caleb looking at me one last time before lowering his eyes. For the first time since I had known him, he looked unsure of himself. But none of this started inside a ballroom. It started inside a quiet townhouse in Atlanta, where every morning followed the same comfortable routine. My alarm rang at 5:30 every weekday. I padded across the hardwood floor, started the coffee maker, packed my lunch into the same blue insulated bag I had carried for years, and checked the weather while oatmeal simmered on the stove. Those peaceful mornings were my favorite part of the day because nothing had gone wrong yet. Caleb usually came downstairs about 15 minutes later, already reading emails before saying good morning. I ironed his shirts while he finished breakfast. I reminded him about meetings he had forgotten. I renewed our insurance policies before the deadlines arrived. I scheduled appointments, organized vacations, paid household bills, and quietly handled dozens of invisible responsibilities that kept our lives running smoothly. Back then, I believed love looked like making someone else's life easier. I worked as an operations coordinator at a boutique hotel in downtown Atlanta, and I genuinely loved my job. Every day brought new challenges. Delayed flights, missing reservations, wedding planners trying not to panic because flowers had arrived late. My responsibility was finding solutions before small problems became unforgettable disasters. Guests rarely remembered my face, but they always remembered how smoothly everything seemed to work. My supervisors trusted me with difficult situations. My coworkers depended on me when things became complicated. Complete strangers thanked me almost every day. Somehow, the only place where I constantly questioned my own value was inside my own home. Looking back now, I can see that respect didn't disappear overnight. It left one small disappointment at a time. Caleb stopped asking about my day. He answered questions without looking away from his phone. If I started telling him something that happened at work, he often interrupted with, "Hold that thought." But somehow the conversation never came back. When friends asked about my career, he smiled and said, "Maya likes keeping things simple." Everyone laughed politely. I laughed too, even though something about the comment stayed with me longer than it should have. When we discussed money, he would gently wave his hand and say, "Leave the financial decisions to me." Numbers are my world. He never sounded angry. That was what made it so easy to excuse. Each moment felt too small to become an argument, so I quietly convinced myself they didn't matter. I built excuses for him faster than he ever had to. He was stressed. He was tired. His promotion demanded more of his attention. The hardest lies to recognize are the ones you keep telling yourself. Then came the dinner party. One of Caleb's coworkers invited several couples over to celebrate a promotion. I bought a bronze dress after saving for months because I wanted to feel confident standing beside my husband. During dinner, someone asked Caleb what had contributed most to his recent success. He laughed, leaned back in his chair, and lifted his wine glass. "Definitely not my wife," he said. A few uncomfortable laughs circled the table. Then he looked directly at me with a smile that felt colder than silence. "She's loyal," he said. "I'll give her that. But Maya will never be enough for the kind of future I'm building." Nobody knew what to say. Someone quickly changed the subject. I picked up my water glass with perfectly steady hands, smiled politely, and finished the rest of dinner without saying another word. Caleb thought he had embarrassed me that night. What he never realized was that, while everyone else was trying to forget what he had said, I quietly stopped believing the version of myself that needed his approval to feel worthy. The next morning, the coffee still brewed at 5:30. The neighborhood was still quiet. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor exactly the way it had every other morning. If someone had looked through our front window, they would have seen an ordinary married couple beginning another workday. Only I knew something had changed. I was no longer trying to explain Caleb's behavior. I was finally paying attention to it. Caleb came downstairs wearing a navy suit, one hand adjusting his tie while the other scrolled through emails on his phone. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Morning," I answered, sliding his travel mug across the counter. 2 creams. No sugar. I had made his coffee that way for nearly 8 years. He took one sip, nodded absent-mindedly, and glanced at his watch. "Are we still having dinner with your parents tomorrow?" I asked. "Depends on work," he replied. "Should I tell your mom we might be late?" He slipped his phone into his pocket just long enough to answer. "Tell her whatever you think is best." I hesitated before speaking again. Karen mentioned a leadership opportunity yesterday. He picked up his briefcase without looking at me. "That's nice. It could be a promotion." He smiled politely, but his attention had already returned to the notification lighting up his phone. "Good for you." Then he walked out the front door before I could finish the conversation. I stood quietly in the kitchen, listening to his car disappear down the street. The coffee maker clicked softly behind me as it finished brewing another pot. I poured myself a second cup and stared out the window for a moment. Respect rarely disappears all at once. It leaves one unfinished sentence at a time. By the time I arrived at the hotel, the lobby was already filled with travelers checking out before early flights. A regional healthcare conference had nearly filled every room, and the front desk was managing a line of frustrated guests after several delayed arrivals. I stepped behind the counter without being asked. Within minutes, we found replacement transportation for one family, rearranged meeting space for a corporate group, and solved a reservation mistake that could have delayed an entire conference schedule. I loved mornings like that. Problems never frightened me. They simply asked someone to stay calm long enough to solve them. Around noon, Karen Mitchell knocked gently on my office door carrying 2 folders and a warm smile. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "Always." She closed the door and handed me one of the folders. It was my annual performance review. Exceptional under pressure. Trusted across every department. Outstanding operational judgment. Natural leader. I smiled as I read each comment, but Karen laughed softly. "Keep going." At the bottom of the final page sat an invitation to interview for Director of Operations at one of our flagship hotels in Charlotte. The position included executive leadership training, relocation assistance, and nearly double my current salary. I looked back at Karen. I wasn't expecting this. "I know," she said. "Corporate has been watching your work for months. You earned every bit of it." Instead of excitement, hesitation quietly settled inside me. My first thought wasn't about the opportunity. It was about Caleb. His career was growing in Atlanta. His clients were here. His networking events were here. Everything he wanted was here. Karen noticed the change in my expression. "Can I give you one piece of advice?" she asked. I nodded. "Don't make yourself smaller because someone else has become comfortable with that version of you." After she left, I remained seated for another minute. The office was completely quiet except for the faint sound of conversations drifting in from the lobby. I read the offer again. Then I closed the folder without making a decision. During the drive home, memories surfaced one after another. The management fellowship in New York that I declined because Caleb said the timing wasn't right. The leadership conference in Las Vegas that I skipped because he wanted me home during one of his busiest weeks. The certification program in Nashville that I postponed because he believed married couples should spend weekends together. None of those decisions felt unfair when I made them. Looking back, they all pointed in the same direction. Every time one of us had the chance to grow, it was always my future that quietly stepped aside. When I walked through the front door that evening, Caleb was already home. His laptop sat open on the dining table beside several financial reports. "Dinner smells good," he said without lifting his eyes from the screen. "It'll be ready in a few minutes," I answered. During dinner, I tried 3 different times to tell him about Charlotte. Every attempt ended the same way. His phone vibrated. He picked it up before I finished speaking. At one point, he smiled at a message, typed a quick reply, then turned the phone face down after noticing me watching. "Busy day?" I asked. "Always." "Anything exciting?" "Just work." A few minutes later, I mentioned the promotion one last time. He sighed almost imperceptibly before saying, "Maya, you already have a good job. Sometimes chasing more only makes life more complicated." He smiled as though he had just offered helpful advice. "Besides, executive jobs aren't for everyone. You like stability. That's one of the things I've always admired about you." Years earlier, I would have accepted those words as encouragement. That night they sounded different. They sounded like another invisible limit placed gently in front of me. After dinner, I cleared the plates while Caleb returned to his laptop. I noticed the blue insulated lunch bag resting beside the kitchen door, ready for another morning exactly like this one. For the first time, I wondered how many years of my life had quietly disappeared inside routines that only benefited one of us. Later that evening, while hanging one of Caleb's suit jackets in the closet before taking it to the dry cleaner, my fingers brushed against a folded receipt. I unfolded it slowly. An upscale steakhouse downtown. 2 dinners. 2 desserts. 1 bottle of wine. Tuesday night. The same Tuesday Caleb had told me he would be working late at the office. I stared at the receipt for several long seconds before folding it exactly the way I had found it and slipping it back into the pocket. Years earlier, I would have searched for an innocent explanation before allowing myself to ask a difficult question. This time I did neither. After Caleb fell asleep, I quietly opened the Charlotte interview folder and began reading every page. Outside, the house was completely silent. Inside, something else had become quiet too. The part of me that kept protecting Caleb from the consequences of his own choices. Before the week was over, I would discover that the dinner receipt wasn't the truth. It was only the first crack in a life I had spent years believing was unbreakable. I slipped the Charlotte interview folder back into my work bag the next morning, but this time it felt heavier than paper should have. It was no longer just another career opportunity. It had quietly become proof that another version of my life still existed. One where my future wasn't limited by someone else's expectations. I arrived at the hotel before sunrise, unlocked my office, and started reviewing the day's arrivals. Within an hour, the lobby had transformed into its usual organized chaos. A wedding party arrived nearly 2 hours early after their flight schedule changed overnight. A corporate conference suddenly needed another meeting room because attendance had doubled. One guest had left important medication in another state, while another family discovered their connecting rooms had never actually been confirmed. Every few minutes another problem appeared, and every few minutes another solution followed. That was always my favorite part of the job. Problems never intimidated me. They simply asked someone to stay calm long enough to solve them. Around lunchtime, Karen stopped by my office carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one beside my keyboard before sitting across from me. "How's Charlotte looking?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "I still haven't decided." She stirred her coffee slowly before looking up. Can I ask you something? Of course. If nobody else's opinion mattered, would you already know your answer? Her question caught me completely off guard. I opened my mouth but nothing came out. Karen smiled kindly. Sometimes we already know what we want. We just spend too much time asking whether everyone else will be comfortable with it. After she left, I remained at my desk staring at the interview folder without opening it. Outside my office window, guests crossed the lobby, carrying suitcases, laughing with their families, beginning vacations or business trips that would probably change something in their lives. I wondered how many of them realized they were standing at the beginning of a completely different future. Confidence doesn't disappear in one dramatic moment. It fades every time you decide someone else's dreams deserve more room than your own. That thought followed me all afternoon. During the drive home, memories surfaced one after another. The management fellowship in New York that I declined because Caleb said the timing was wrong. The leadership conference in Las Vegas that I skipped because he wanted me home during one of his busiest weeks. The certification program in Nashville that I postponed because he believed married couples should spend more weekends together. None of those decisions seemed unfair when I made them. Looking back, they all pointed in the same direction. Every time our futures competed for space, mine quietly stepped aside. Caleb was sitting on the back patio when I arrived home. His laptop rested beside a glass of iced tea while he answered emails. Long day? I asked. Busy, he replied without lifting his eyes from the screen. How about yours? Busy too. I waited, hoping he might ask another question. He never did. Instead, he nodded once and returned to typing. I stood there for another moment before walking inside. Somehow, that silence hurt more than another argument ever could have. While dinner cooked in the oven, I listened to the familiar sounds filling the house. The dishwasher hummed softly. A lawnmower passed somewhere down the street. The clock above the refrigerator marked another ordinary evening. My blue insulated lunch bag still rested beside the kitchen door where I had left it that morning. It struck me that almost every object inside the house stayed exactly where I placed it. I wondered why I kept believing the relationship would somehow change on its own. During dinner, I finally mentioned the interview. Karen offered me a director of operations interview in Charlotte. Caleb paused just long enough to swallow before setting his fork down. Charlotte? Yes. That's 4 hours away. I know. He leaned back in his chair and sighed. So you're turning it down? I haven't made a decision yet. He smiled politely, the same smile he often used when he believed a conversation was already finished. Maya, let's be realistic. My career is here. Our house is here. Everything we've built is here. He picked up his water glass before adding. Besides, those executive positions come with a lot of pressure. You've always preferred keeping things steady. The words sounded almost complimentary, but they quietly placed another ceiling over my future. Before I could answer, his phone vibrated beside his plate. He smiled at the screen and immediately started typing. The conversation ended without either of us saying another word. Later that night, I opened my laptop and searched for apartments in Charlotte. Small downtown buildings, tree-lined streets, coffee shops within walking distance. I imagined carrying my blue lunch bag into a completely different office, introducing myself to people who knew nothing about the version of me I had slowly outgrown. The thought should have frightened me. Instead, it felt strangely peaceful. The following afternoon, I volunteered to coordinate a charity luncheon hosted at the hotel. Nearly 300 guests attended, including nonprofit leaders, business owners, and hospitality executives from across the Southeast. A florist delivered the wrong centerpieces. One keynote speaker missed a connecting flight. The audiovisual system failed less than 30 minutes before the program began. By the time the first guests entered the ballroom, every problem had already been solved. As attendees began leaving that afternoon, an older gentleman wearing a charcoal suit stopped beside me. "You're the one who kept all of this running so smoothly, aren't you?" he asked. I smiled. I had an excellent team. He nodded thoughtfully. The best leaders usually give the credit away first. Before I could ask his name, someone called him from across the ballroom, and he excused himself with a polite smile. I watched him disappear into the crowd before returning to work. That evening when I arrived home, I heard Caleb speaking quietly behind the nearly closed door of his home office. I wasn't trying to listen, but one sentence carried clearly through the silence. She still doesn't know. Just give me one more week. I stopped walking. My hand tightened around my car keys, but I never moved closer to the door. Instead, I quietly walked into the kitchen, placed my keys inside the ceramic bowl by the entrance, and started preparing coffee for the next morning. The hardest lies to uncover aren't the ones people tell you. They are the ones your hope keeps asking you to ignore. At that moment, I stopped wondering whether something was wrong. I started wondering how much of my marriage had been built on things I was never supposed to see. I didn't ask Caleb about the phone call. I didn't search through his office after he fell asleep, and I didn't unlock his phone while he was in the shower. For years, I had trusted him without hesitation. I wasn't going to become someone who chased the truth through suspicion. Instead, I decided to do something much simpler. I started paying attention. The next morning, I left the house 10 minutes later than usual. As I locked the front door, I noticed Caleb standing beside his car with his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was low, almost careful. The moment he saw me walking down the driveway, he ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. "Have a good day," he called with an easy smile. "You too," I replied. He drove away before I even reached my own car. I watched his taillights disappear around the corner and realized something I should have noticed months earlier. He had become very good at ending conversations the moment I entered the room. I stood there for another second before getting into my car. The morning air felt cooler than usual. I reached for the same blue insulated lunch bag sitting on the passenger seat, and suddenly realized how many mornings had started exactly like this. The routines had never changed. Only I had. At work, the pace was relentless. A national healthcare conference had filled nearly every room in the hotel, and every department seemed to need something at once. A delayed flight forced dozens of unexpected early check-ins. One ballroom had to be completely rearranged after attendance exceeded expectations. A bridal party discovered half their floral arrangements had been delivered to the wrong hotel. Every few minutes another problem landed on my desk, and every time, I found myself doing what I had always done best: staying calm while everyone else rushed. By early afternoon, everything was back on schedule. Karen stopped by my office carrying another folder. "Corporate confirmed your interview," she said with a smile. "Next Tuesday. Charlotte has already booked your flight, hotel, and transportation." I looked down at the itinerary before smiling back at her. "It suddenly feels real." Karen nodded. "It has always been real. You're only allowing yourself to believe it now." Before leaving, she paused at my office door. "One more thing, Maya." "Yes." Never confuse being comfortable with being fulfilled. After she left, I placed the interview folder on top of my desk instead of hiding it inside a drawer. It seemed like a small decision, but it felt important. For years, I had treated my own ambitions like something that needed permission to exist. Around 4 that afternoon, Caleb called. "Don't wait for dinner," he said. "Another client meeting?" I asked. "Yes. It'll probably run late." His answer came so quickly that it sounded rehearsed. "Drive safely," I said. "Always." The call lasted less than 30 seconds. That evening, I heated leftover soup, ate alone at the kitchen island, and reviewed my interview schedule while soft rain tapped against the windows. When I finished, I rinsed my bowl, placed it beside the sink, and noticed the bronze dress still hanging in the hallway closet where I had left it after the dinner party. I hadn't touched it since that night. Some memories stay inside ordinary objects long after the moment has passed. Caleb walked through the front door shortly after 9. As he loosened his tie, I caught the faint scent of a different cologne. It wasn't the one I had given him for Christmas. I noticed because I had spent nearly an hour choosing that bottle, convinced he would think of me every time he wore it. "Long meeting?" I asked. "Very." He smiled briefly before reaching into the refrigerator for a bottle of sparkling water. "I'm exhausted." Then he disappeared into his office without asking a single question about my day. Respect doesn't disappear because of one cruel moment. It disappears when someone stops being curious about your life. The following morning, I gathered several of his jackets before leaving for work, so I could drop them off at the dry cleaner. As always, I checked every pocket first. Loose change, business cards, a receipt from a gas station. Then my fingers found a folded valet ticket. I opened it carefully. It belonged to a luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta. The date immediately caught my attention. Saturday evening. Caleb had told me he spent that Saturday attending a leadership seminar across town. According to the ticket, his car had arrived just after 6 o'clock and hadn't left until nearly midnight. I quietly folded the ticket and slipped it back into the pocket exactly as I had found it. Later that afternoon, while confirming accommodations for an executive guest, I remembered that the same luxury hotel belonged to one of our hospitality partners. Curious, I searched the publicly available event calendar through our internal reservation system. One listing immediately stood out. Whitmore Capital Private Partnership Reception. Invitation only. Saturday evening. The exact date printed on the valet ticket. I stared at the screen without touching the keyboard. I still didn't know why Caleb had been there, but I no longer doubted that he had lied. That night, he came home in an unusually cheerful mood. He suggested ordering dessert from the bakery a few blocks away, and asked whether I wanted to watch a movie together. It felt almost rehearsed, as though he suddenly remembered he was supposed to act like an attentive husband. Halfway through the movie, his phone vibrated on the coffee table. He reached for it so quickly that his glass tipped over, spilling water across the wood. As he grabbed the phone, the screen lit up for barely a second before he turned it over. I read only one line. Everything is ready for Friday. No name. No explanation. Just one sentence. Caleb forced a small laugh. Work never really stops. I handed him a towel and smiled politely. I guess it doesn't. A few minutes later, he carried the empty glasses into the kitchen while his phone remained on the coffee table beside me. For just a second I thought about turning it over. Instead, I picked it up and handed it back to him when he returned. I wanted the truth, but I wanted to recognize myself when this was over. As I turned off the television that night, one thought refused to leave me. Whatever was waiting for Caleb on Friday had been carefully planned long before I found that first receipt. And somehow, I knew that Friday would answer questions I hadn't even learned to ask yet. I didn't wait for Friday to answer my questions. I had spent too many years explaining Caleb's behavior in ways that protected him instead of protecting myself. This time, I decided to stop guessing and start collecting facts. On Wednesday morning, before leaving for work, I logged into our shared checking account to confirm the mortgage payment had cleared. At first, everything looked exactly the way it always had. Then I noticed the balance. It was lower than I expected. Not by a few $100s but by several thousand. I opened the transaction history and slowly scrolled through the previous few months. One transfer immediately caught my attention. $18,000 had been moved into an investment account that listed only Caleb's name. I refreshed the page, convinced I had misunderstood what I was seeing. The transaction remained exactly where it had been. Caleb had always insisted on handling our investments because, as he often reminded me, numbers are my world. I had believed him. I handled insurance renewals, household bills, appointments, vacations, and everything else that kept our lives organized. Somewhere along the way, I stopped looking at the part of our life he controlled. Trust should never require blindness. Quietly, I downloaded every statement I could legally access and saved copies to a secure folder. Then I closed my laptop, picked up my blue insulated lunch bag, and drove to work exactly on time. Nobody at the hotel noticed anything different about me. Guests still needed directions. Managers still needed decisions. Housekeeping still called when unexpected requests appeared. I solved every problem with the same calm voice I always used. The difference was that, for the first time, I had stopped trying to solve the wrong person's problems. During lunch, I sat alone in the employee courtyard and reviewed 6 months of financial records. The $18,000 transfer wasn't the first one. There had been smaller transfers almost every month. $800, $1,500, $2,200. None of them looked alarming on their own. Together, they totaled more than $40,000. I locked my phone and sat quietly for a moment. A light breeze moved through the courtyard, carrying the smell of freshly cut grass. Normally, I would have used those few peaceful minutes to answer emails before heading back inside. Instead, I simply breathed. Money doesn't disappear by accident. Neither does trust. Karen stepped outside carrying her coffee and smiled when she saw me. "You skipped lunch again," she said. I laughed softly. "I guess I have a lot on my mind." She sat down across from me. Charlotte. I nodded, allowing her to believe that was all I was thinking about. She smiled. Whatever you decide, make sure the decision belongs to you. After she walked back inside, I repeated those words to myself. Make sure the decision belongs to you. That evening, Caleb mentioned he would be leaving early Friday morning for what he called an executive planning retreat. Just one night, he said while scrolling through his calendar. I should be home sometime Saturday afternoon. I looked up from my plate. Where's the retreat? The Ridgeview Conference Center. His answer came so naturally that someone else might never have questioned it. Unfortunately for him, I already knew Ridgeview wasn't hosting any executive retreat that weekend. Earlier that week, I had reviewed regional hospitality event schedules while helping organize accommodations for one of our corporate clients. I remember because I had personally confirmed every property on the list. I simply nodded. Do you need me to pack another dress shirt? He smiled. No. I already packed everything. The answer sounded ordinary, almost affectionate. That was the frightening part. Lies often arrive wearing the same voice as the truth. After dinner, Caleb carried his laptop into the living room while I cleaned the kitchen. As I walked past the dining table carrying 2 empty glasses, a calendar reminder appeared briefly on his computer screen before fading away. Friday, 6:30 in the evening. Whitmore Grand Hotel. Private partnership reception. I kept walking as though I had never seen it. I placed the glasses into the sink, turned on the water, and continued washing dishes. A few moments later, Caleb thanked me for cleaning up dinner before carrying his laptop upstairs. He smiled exactly the way he always did. The only difference was that I finally understood smiles could become habits too. The following morning after Caleb left for work, I called the airline listed on a recent travel confirmation that had accidentally appeared in our shared email account several weeks earlier. I politely asked the customer service representative to confirm his reservation for Friday morning. After searching for a few moments, she apologized. I'm sorry, ma'am. I don't see any reservation under that passenger's name. I thanked her warmly and ended the call. Then I sat quietly at the kitchen table while soft rain tapped against the windows. My eyes drifted toward the bronze dress hanging in the hallway closet. It reminded me how easily one sentence could change the direction of an entire life. Everything suddenly became very simple. Caleb wasn't flying anywhere. He wasn't attending a business retreat. He had built another version of reality, expecting me to accept it because I always had before. I reached into my purse, removed the business card an attorney had given me after a hotel networking event months earlier, and placed it carefully on the table. For years, I believed saving a marriage meant giving someone endless opportunities to tell the truth. That morning, I finally understood something much more important. Sometimes the strongest decision isn't fighting harder for the relationship. Sometimes it's quietly preparing for the moment when you no longer need to fight at all. And for the first time since that dinner party, I realized I was no longer afraid of whatever Friday was about to reveal. I called the attorney that same afternoon and scheduled the earliest appointment he had available. His office overlooked Piedmont Park from the 3rd floor of a quiet brick building that blended into the surrounding law firms and accounting offices. I carried one neatly organized folder containing bank statements, screenshots, transaction histories, and a notebook filled with dates, times, and conversations. Every page contained only facts. No assumptions. No accusations. Just evidence. He spent nearly half an hour reviewing everything without interrupting. When he finally closed the folder, he leaned back in his chair and nodded once. You've already done something most people never do, he said. You documented the truth before confronting the person who created the problem. I let out a slow breath. What should I do now? He slid a yellow legal pad across the desk. Continue gathering every financial document you can legally access. Tax returns, retirement accounts, insurance policies, mortgage records. Make copies. Store them somewhere safe. Most importantly, don't tell him what you know. If he believes everything is normal, he's more likely to keep acting normally. I nodded as I folded the checklist and placed it inside my folder. Before I left, he added one more sentence. Stay patient. Truth has a way of becoming even clearer when people think nobody is paying attention. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something unexpected. For weeks, I had been carrying fear everywhere I went. That afternoon, I carried a plan instead. There is a quiet kind of confidence that comes from preparing instead of pretending. Friday morning arrived with the same routine that had defined our marriage for years. I woke before sunrise, brewed coffee, packed my lunch into the same blue insulated lunch bag, and placed Caleb's favorite travel mug beside the coffee maker. He came downstairs carrying a new leather duffel bag that still looked stiff from barely being used. "I should be back tomorrow afternoon," he said while checking the time on his watch. "Drive safely," I replied. He leaned over and kissed my forehead before picking up his bag and walking toward the front door. It was such a familiar gesture that, for one brief moment, I almost questioned everything I had discovered. Then the front door closed behind him, and the sound of his car fading down the street answered the question for me. I waited until the neighborhood became quiet again before changing into a navy blazer instead of my usual work clothes. Then I called Karen. "I need to take a personal day." She didn't ask for an explanation. "Take whatever time you need," she said. "We'll handle everything here." 45 minutes later, I parked across the street from the Whitmore Grand Hotel. Business travelers rolled suitcases through the entrance while valets greeted arriving guests with practiced smiles. I remained inside my car for several minutes, reminding myself why I was there. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for clarity. I reached into the passenger seat, picked up my blue lunch bag, and moved it to the back seat. It suddenly felt strange seeing something so ordinary beside me on a day that would quietly change the rest of my life. Just before 6 o'clock that evening, a black luxury sedan pulled beneath the covered entrance. Caleb stepped out wearing the charcoal suit he usually reserved for company award dinners. He straightened his tie, checked his reflection in the glass doors, and smiled before walking confidently inside. I counted slowly to 60 before crossing the street. The hotel lobby felt elegant without trying too hard. Fresh flowers decorated polished marble tables. A pianist played softly near the grand staircase while guests moved comfortably between restaurants and meeting rooms. Nobody paid any attention to me. I walked toward the event directory mounted beside the ballroom corridor. One listing immediately caught my eye. Whitmore Capital Private Partnership Reception. Grand Ballroom B. Invitation only. I stepped away from the directory and wandered toward a display showcasing architectural models for a future luxury resort. From there, I could see the ballroom entrance without attracting attention. A few minutes later, Caleb appeared again. He stood beside a woman wearing an ivory business suit, laughing comfortably while speaking with another couple. She rested her hand lightly against his arm for just a moment before introducing him to someone else. They moved through the room with the easy familiarity of people who had spent more than one evening together. My heart sank, but my expression never changed. The truth hurts differently when you have already begun accepting it. Suddenly, Caleb turned his head in my direction. For one brief second, I thought our eyes were about to meet. I stepped behind one of the architectural display panels just as another group of guests walked between us. My pulse quickened, but I stayed perfectly still. A moment later, I carefully looked back. Caleb had already turned away, smiling as he continued his conversation. Moments later, photographers gathered near the ballroom entrance as another group of guests arrived. An older gentleman wearing a charcoal suit entered the lobby surrounded by executives and board members. I recognized him immediately. He was the same man who had complimented my work after the charity luncheon months earlier. Someone standing nearby leaned toward another guest and quietly said, "Mr. Whitmore just arrived." So that was his name. Ethan Whitmore. He greeted people one by one before disappearing into the ballroom with the other executives. Caleb remained several steps behind them, waiting patiently for an opportunity to introduce himself. Watching him from across the lobby, I understood something I had never fully seen before. At home, Caleb always acted like the most important person in every room. Here, he was simply another man hoping someone more powerful would notice him. I quietly walked back outside, sat inside my car, and opened the notes application on my phone. I recorded everything I had seen. The arrival time, the event name, the woman standing beside Caleb, Ethan Whitmore's arrival. No opinions. No conclusions. Only facts. As I placed my phone back into my purse, I looked one final time at the hotel entrance. I realized I was no longer grieving the marriage I thought I had lost. I was grieving the illusion I had protected for far too long. Somehow, letting go of the illusion hurt less than continuing to live inside it. The following Monday morning, I accepted the interview in Charlotte before I had the chance to talk myself out of it. The recruiter answered on the second ring, and I could hear genuine excitement in her voice. "We were hoping you would call," she said. Within 15 minutes, my flight, hotel reservation, and interview schedule had all been confirmed. After the call ended, I remained seated at my desk, staring through the window overlooking the hotel parking lot. For the first time in years, I had made an important decision without wondering whether Caleb would approve. It felt unfamiliar. It also felt right. Sometimes courage is nothing more than making one decision before fear has time to speak. The rest of the week moved quickly. The hotel was preparing for another large convention, and every department seemed to need something at once. A shipment of conference materials arrived at the wrong loading dock. A catering order had to be redesigned after attendance unexpectedly increased. 2 department managers disagreed over staffing assignments only hours before a major event. I moved from one problem to the next, listening first and deciding second. By late afternoon, everything was back on schedule. Karen stopped by my office carrying 2 cups of coffee. She placed one on my desk before taking the chair across from me. "How are you feeling about Charlotte?" she asked. I smiled honestly. Excited. Then I laughed quietly. And terrified. Karen smiled. "Good. The opportunities worth taking usually make us feel both." She looked at me for another moment before continuing. "Maya, I've managed hotels for more than 25 years. I've watched talented people spend entire careers waiting for someone else to believe in them. Don't make that mistake. Walk into that interview already knowing what you bring to the table." After she left, I remained in my office for another minute. I reached down, picked up my familiar blue insulated lunch bag and smiled to myself. It had traveled with me through hundreds of ordinary workdays. Soon it would be making the trip to a completely different city. Somehow, that simple thought made the future feel real. The following Tuesday, I flew to Charlotte. As the airplane climbed above the clouds, I looked out the window and realized it was the first business trip I had ever taken without feeling guilty for leaving someone behind. That thought surprised me more than anything else. The flagship hotel overlooked the Charlotte skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. The lobby felt elegant without feeling distant. Managers greeted housekeepers by name. Executives stopped to thank front desk employees after helping guests. Respect flowed in every direction. Leadership leaves clues long before anyone says a word. My interviews lasted nearly 5 hours. They asked about staffing shortages, guest recovery, budgeting, crisis management, leadership philosophy, and operational strategy. Nobody asked whether relocating would affect my marriage. Nobody questioned whether I was ready for greater responsibility. They simply wanted to understand how I solved problems. For the first time in years, I spoke confidently about my accomplishments without softening them to make someone else more comfortable. After the final interview, one of the senior executives invited me on a tour of the property. As we walked through a newly renovated ballroom, she smiled and said, "The strongest leaders are usually the quietest people in the room because they spend more time listening than proving themselves." I thought about the older gentleman I had met twice before, Ethan Whitmore. Without realizing it, I had already seen that philosophy reflected inside his company. 3 days later, an email arrived just before lunch. I opened it expecting another routine corporate message. Instead, I found a formal offer for the Director of Operations position in Charlotte. I read the letter twice before allowing myself to smile. The salary was nearly double what I was earning. The relocation package included executive leadership training, temporary housing, and moving expenses. This time I didn't wonder what Caleb would think. I signed the offer immediately. Every future begins with one decision that feels impossible until you make it. That same afternoon, I met with my attorney again. Together, we reviewed every financial record, retirement account, insurance policy, mortgage statement, and investment transfer. By the time our meeting ended, the divorce paperwork was complete. There was nothing left to organize, only the right time to file. 2 weeks later, I quietly rented a small apartment in Charlotte. It overlooked a tree-lined street with a neighborhood coffee shop on one corner and a bookstore on the other. I bought only what I needed: a bed, a sofa, a dining table, a coffee maker. I unlocked the apartment for the first time, carried my suitcase inside, set my keys in the same familiar way I always had, and placed my blue insulated lunch bag on the kitchen counter. For a second, the apartment was completely silent. Then I found myself smiling before I even realized I was smiling. It was the first smile in a very long time that belonged entirely to me. Standing alone inside that apartment, I expected to feel lonely. Instead, I felt possibility. I finally understood that starting over wasn't about losing the life I had built. It was about making room for the life I had been postponing. At that moment, I had no idea where this new path would eventually lead. I only knew that saying yes to one interview had quietly become the first step toward a future Caleb had never imagined. And the next person to recognize my worth would do so because of the woman I had become, not because of the woman I had once tried so hard to be. The divorce papers were served on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Caleb called me 12 times before sunset. I answered only once. "Maya, what is this?" he asked, sounding more confused than angry. "Exactly what it looks like," I replied calmly. "Please let your attorney read everything before we talk." A long silence followed. Finally, he spoke again. "We can fix this." I looked through the office window as guests arrived beneath the covered entrance of the hotel. "You had countless opportunities to tell me the truth," I said quietly. "You chose not to." Before he could answer, I ended the call. Some conversations end long before anyone hangs up. That evening, Caleb came home earlier than I had seen him in months. For the first time in a very long time, he wanted to explain everything. He blamed work pressure. He blamed investment opportunities. He blamed poor decisions that had gradually become bigger than he intended. He even blamed himself. I listened without interrupting until he finally ran out of explanations. Then I placed a neatly organized folder on the dining table between us. Inside were copies of the bank transfers, investment statements, financial records, the valet ticket, and every document my attorney had helped me collect. Caleb slowly turned each page. His confidence disappeared one document at a time. Finally, he looked up. "You've been investigating me?" I shook my head. "No." I met his eyes for the first time all evening. I finally stopped ignoring what was already in front of me. He lowered his head again. There was nothing left to argue about because facts have a way of ending debates that excuses never can. The divorce moved forward without public arguments or dramatic courtroom scenes. Every financial record had already been documented. Every account had already been verified. The settlement reflected exactly what each of us had contributed throughout our marriage. I kept my retirement savings, my personal investments, and the portion of the house my income had helped build. When everything was finalized, I packed the last of my belongings into a moving truck before sunrise. I picked up my blue insulated lunch bag from the kitchen counter, looked around the empty house one final time, and quietly closed the front door behind me. As the Atlanta skyline slowly disappeared in my rearview mirror, I expected to feel heartbreak. Instead, I rolled down the window, breathed in the cool morning air, and realized my shoulders no longer felt heavy. Sometimes freedom arrives so quietly that you only recognize it when the weight finally disappears. My new position demanded everything I had learned during the previous decade. There were staffing shortages, renovation deadlines, budget meetings, unexpected inspections, and community partnerships that required constant attention. Every challenge reminded me why I had chosen this career in the first place. My ideas were welcomed. My decisions were trusted. My work spoke for itself. Nobody treated my ambition like something that needed to be managed. Confidence grows quickly once it has room to breathe. Nearly a year later, our hotel hosted a regional leadership conference, attended by executives from across Whitmore Hospitality. Karen happened to be attending as well. During one networking session, she walked toward me with a familiar face beside her. "Maya," she said, smiling warmly. "I think it's finally time for a proper introduction." Ethan Whitmore extended his hand with the same calm professionalism I remembered from Atlanta. "We've crossed paths before," he said. "The charity luncheon. Then the partnership reception." I laughed softly. I was beginning to think we only met at large events. He smiled. Karen has been telling me about your work for months. I'm glad we finally have the chance to talk. That conversation lasted only 15 minutes, but it never felt forced. Over the following months, our paths crossed naturally through leadership meetings, property visits, executive workshops, and community projects. Sometimes we discussed hotel operations over coffee before morning meetings. Once he walked into a conference room carrying 2 cups of coffee, stopped, looked around, and laughed. "Wrong meeting," he said. "I have officially proven I need more sleep." We both laughed before walking together to the correct room. Moments like that reminded me he was simply a thoughtful man, not someone trying to impress the people around him. Several months later, one of our coastal resort properties experienced a major operational crisis, only hours before hosting an international hospitality conference. A software failure disrupted guest check-ins, room assignments, and event scheduling across the property. Teams were overwhelmed, guests were growing frustrated, and every minute mattered. I immediately organized department leaders into small response groups, reassigned staff, created temporary manual check-in stations, and established communication updates every 15 minutes. Within 3 hours, the lobby had become calm again. By evening, the conference opened on schedule. As the last guests entered the ballroom, Ethan walked over holding 2 cups of coffee. "Karen was right," he said, handing one to me. "You never panic." I smiled. "Panic has never solved a single problem." He laughed. "I'm going to remember that." It was only after watching me lead through one of the busiest days of my career that our friendship quietly became something deeper. Nearly 2 years after I accepted the position in Charlotte, Ethan invited me to spend a quiet weekend at one of the company's coastal resorts after another successful property review. Early Sunday morning, we carried coffee onto a wooden deck overlooking the ocean. Waves rolled gently toward the shore while the sunrise painted the water with soft shades of gold. Ethan smiled, reached into his jacket pocket, and held out a small ring box. "There's one question I've wanted to ask for a long time," he said. Then he looked directly into my eyes. "Will you marry me?" I smiled before he had even finished speaking. "Yes," I answered. A few months later, while reviewing the guest list for the upcoming Whitmore Foundation Gala, one familiar name quietly caught my attention. Caleb Bennett. I looked at it for only a second before closing the folder. 2 years earlier, I had wondered whether I would ever be enough. Now, the only unfinished conversation left was the one life was about to complete for me. The Whitmore Foundation Gala looked almost exactly the way I remembered it. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly near the stage while conversations drifted through the ballroom like a steady current. 2 years earlier, I had walked into this same hotel carrying questions I was too afraid to ask. Tonight, I walked in carrying something far more valuable: peace. Before leaving the house that evening, I slipped my familiar blue insulated lunch bag into the pantry beside the coffee maker. I smiled without really knowing why. It had followed me through the hardest chapter of my life and into the happiest one. Some ordinary things become reminders that extraordinary change is possible. Ethan smiled as we greeted guests arriving for the evening. "Everything ready?" he asked. "Everything," I answered. He gently squeezed my hand before stepping away to welcome several longtime donors and members of the foundation board. I turned toward the foundation display where photographers were gathering for the opening photographs. That was when I saw Caleb. He stood only a few feet away, holding a champagne glass that never reached his lips. His eyes moved from my face to the wedding band on my hand before settling on the name displayed beneath the foundation logo. Maya Whitmore. For several long seconds he simply stared. He looked exactly the same, only I no longer felt like the same woman. It was the same expression I had worn years earlier when he told an entire room that I would never be enough. Only this time, neither of us needed to say anything. The truth was already standing between us. Eventually he walked toward me. "Maya," he said quietly. "Congratulations." "Thank you, Caleb." He nodded awkwardly before glancing across the ballroom. "I didn't know. I had no idea." I smiled politely. Life has a way of surprising all of us. Another silence settled between us. Then he looked toward Ethan, who was speaking with several members of the Executive Investment Committee. My company submitted a proposal for one of Whitmore Hospitality's development projects, he said. We were hoping to earn the contract. Before I could respond, Ethan returned carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. I thought you might want this, he said, handing one to me before noticing Caleb. Caleb introduced himself, and Ethan greeted him with the same professional courtesy he offered every guest. It's a pleasure to meet you. Caleb smiled politely. Likewise. I believe my firm recently submitted a proposal for the Lakeside Hospitality Development. Ethan nodded. Yes. Our Executive Investment Committee completed its review earlier this week. Caleb waited hopefully. Ethan continued in the same calm voice. The committee selected another firm. They believed the other proposal offered a stronger long-term operational strategy for the project. There was no satisfaction in Ethan's tone. No attempt to embarrass anyone. It was simply a business decision delivered with respect. Caleb lowered his eyes for a brief moment before nodding. I understand. Thank you. An event coordinator approached to let us know the evening program was about to begin. Ethan smiled at me. Shall we? Just as we started to walk away, Caleb quietly spoke my name again. I turned back. He looked at me for several seconds before finally saying the words I never expected to hear. I was wrong. I waited patiently. I spent years chasing rooms full of strangers, he said softly. I never realized I was ignoring the person waiting for me at home. His voice cracked just enough to sound real. I thought success would fix everything. It didn't. I searched for the anger I once imagined I would feel if this moment ever happened. It was gone. So was the need to prove anything. Healing is the quiet moment when someone else's opinion no longer has the power to rewrite your story. I smiled gently. The hardest part was never hearing you say I wasn't enough, I said. The hardest part was believing you. He lowered his eyes without answering. You didn't lose me because I met someone else. I continued quietly. You lost me the day you stopped respecting me. Everything that happened after that was simply the consequence of a choice you made long before either of us realized it. Caleb nodded slowly. I understand that now. I hope you do, I said sincerely. Because success will never replace kindness, and ambition will never be more valuable than respect. Ethan waited beside me without interrupting, giving me the space to finish the conversation on my own terms. Together, we walked toward the stage as the evening program began. Scholarships were announced for hospitality students. Grants were awarded to community organizations. New workforce development programs were introduced for young professionals entering the industry I had always loved. As the audience applauded, I looked around the ballroom and thought about the woman I used to be. She believed love meant sacrificing pieces of herself one quiet compromise at a time. She believed loyalty meant staying silent when respect slowly disappeared. She believed someone else's opinion determined her worth. She was wrong. Looking around that room, I realized my life had never changed because I married Ethan Whitmore. It changed the morning I stopped asking someone else for permission to believe in myself. Every opportunity that followed, every promotion, every new beginning, every moment of peace grew from that single decision. For years, I believed the happiest chapter of my life would begin when someone finally chose me. I was wrong. It began the morning I chose myself. The man who once said I would never be enough accidentally gave me the greatest gift of my life. He forced me to discover that I already was. As Ethan reached for my hand, I smiled, thinking about the woman who used to carry an extra umbrella for everyone else. I still carried one. The difference was that I had finally learned to keep one for myself too.